Jason Myers had once stood at the top, living the life many only dream of. His business had grown from a small startup to a thriving enterprise that everyone in the industry respected. With his two trusted partners, Derek and Steve, by his side, success seemed like a guarantee. Even his personal life seemed perfect. A beautiful home, a stunning wife, Clara, and all the luxury money could buy. But all of that came crashing down one fateful afternoon. Jason sat at his desk in the plush office he'd built with years of hard work, reviewing quarterly reports, when the email notification appeared on his screen. Urgent. Meeting with the board. 5 p.m. today. His heart sank. He hadn't called for any emergency meetings. An hour later, the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Derek and Steve had been plotting behind his back for months, siphoning funds, signing shady contracts, and framing him for it all. The board meeting was nothing more than an ambush orchestrated to make him the scapegoat. Jason was removed as CEO, forced to sell his shares for next to nothing, and effectively exiled from the very company he'd built with his own hands. That same evening, he returned home, hoping for solace from his wife. But the cold look in Clara's eyes as she sat in their living room told him everything. "You're broke, aren't you?" she said, her voice flat. I'll figure it out, Clara. We'll get through this together." Jason tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away, standing up with a sigh. "You don't get it, do you? I didn't sign up for getting through anything, Jason. I've had enough of this." Her voice hardened. "Derek told me everything." Jason's world shifted again. "Derek? What does he have to do with this?" She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorway, avoiding his eyes. "I'm leaving you. Derek, he's been there for me. He has the money now. He's everything I thought you would be." Jason couldn't believe what he was hearing. His business gone, his wife walking out, his whole life disintegrating in a matter of hours. It wasn't just betrayal. It was complete annihilation. "You're leaving me for him? My partner, after what he did?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Clara didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel, grabbed her suitcase, and walked out the door, leaving Jason standing in the silence of their once happy home, shattered. The following months were a blur of pain and anger for Jason. He lost the house, burned through what little money he had left, and moved into a tiny, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. He cut himself off from everyone, unable to bear the humiliation of facing old friends or colleagues. He avoided their pitying looks, the whispers behind his back. But deep inside, something else was brewing, something darker. It wasn't just the loss of his business, his reputation, or his marriage. It was the rage of knowing that the people he trusted the most had orchestrated his downfall, and worse, had taken pleasure in it. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Derek's smug face and Clara walking away without a second thought. It wasn't long before Jason realized he had two choices. He could let his rage consume him, or he could use it as fuel. The fire inside him sparked a new resolve. He wouldn't just get back on his feet. He would take everything back. And Derek? He would make sure Derek paid for everything. Jason started small, working odd jobs to make ends meet while keeping tabs on his former partners. Derek and Steve had grown even wealthier after taking full control of the company, flaunting their success at every opportunity. Clara was now living with Derek in the lavish house Jason had once called home. It sickened him, but he didn't let it distract him. Instead, he watched. He waited. He plotted. One night, while working late at a bar to pay the bills, Jason overheard two men discussing a major business deal involving Derek's company. He kept quiet, listening to the conversation that confirmed what he'd suspected all along. Derek's success was built on illegal backdoor deals and falsified records. But this time, Derek had gone too far. There were gaps, mistakes that Jason could exploit. It was a turning point. Jason realized that if he played this right, he could bring Derek down, expose his dirty dealings, and take back what was stolen from him. And Clara? She'd be left with nothing but regret for siding with a man who would soon be in handcuffs. Jason's first move was to reconnect with old contacts. He reached out to a former colleague, Ryan, who had always respected Jason's work ethic and honesty. Ryan now worked at a regulatory agency, and though their relationship had been strained since Jason's fall from grace, Ryan listened when Jason laid out the evidence he'd gathered. Reluctantly at first, but ultimately convinced by the trail of corruption, Ryan agreed to help him, on one condition: Jason would need more proof. With Ryan's guidance, Jason infiltrated Derek's network. He started talking to old employees, digging through company records, and hacking into emails. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Derek's entire empire was built on lies. Fraud, bribery, money laundering, it was all there, waiting to be exposed. But Jason knew he couldn't rush. He needed to be meticulous to make sure there was no way Derek could wiggle out of the charges. He spent weeks gathering evidence, often working late into the night in his small apartment. The deeper he went, the more dangerous the game became. Derek had powerful friends, and if Jason wasn't careful, one misstep could land him in serious trouble. In the midst of all this, Jason couldn't help but wonder about Clara. Did she know about Derek's crimes? Or was she just another pawn? It didn't really matter anymore. She'd made her choice, and Jason was long past caring. But the thought of her standing by Derek's side when everything came crashing down, that would be a fitting end. As Jason's plan neared completion, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anxiety. The endgame was approaching, and soon he would watch everything unravel. Derek would be ruined. Clara would be left with nothing. And Jason? He would rise from the ashes, stronger than ever before. Jason sat in the dim glow of his apartment, the soft hum of his computer, the only sound breaking the silence. On his screen, files flickered, emails, transaction logs, confidential reports. Months of work, sleepless nights, and the singular goal of bringing Derek down had led to this moment. He gathered enough evidence to sink Derek's entire empire. But it wasn't enough for Jason to just destroy him. No, Derek needed to feel it. Every crack, every fracture in his perfect life. Jason wanted him to live through the slow agony of losing everything, just like he had. First, Jason needed to spread rumors, whispers in the right circles. He couldn't do this alone, so he turned to the people he had once known well: former business associates, small-time investors, and rival companies who had always been envious of Derek's rise. They were all too eager to listen to a disgraced man with a vendetta, but Jason didn't care about their motives. He fed them bits of information, carefully curated lies, some truths, but all designed to make Derek's foundation crack. It started small. An investor pulled out of a major deal at the last minute, citing concerns about Derek's financial stability. Then, rumors spread that Derek's company was under investigation by the authorities. Derek's smug confidence began to waver as the whispers grew louder. But Jason stayed in the shadows, watching as his former partner's pristine reputation started to unravel. At the same time, Jason worked to reclaim a piece of his own life. He reached out to old friends, slowly reconnecting with those who hadn't turned their backs on him when everything fell apart. It wasn't easy. He had been bitter and angry, pushing people away in his darkest moments. But a few had stayed loyal, and one of them was Ryan. Ryan, the regulatory agent who had agreed to help, kept Jason updated on the investigation. The deeper they dug into Derek's financials, the more they uncovered. There were offshore accounts, shady contracts, and falsified financial statements, clear proof of Derek's crimes. And now that they had enough evidence, Ryan hinted that the investigation would soon go public. But Jason knew this was only the beginning. Derek was too well-connected, too clever to go down without a fight. His powerful allies wouldn't abandon him easily. So, Jason waited, watching Derek squirm as more deals fell through, his investors pulling away one by one. The tension was palpable, and it was only a matter of time before Derek came looking for answers. And then, as expected, Derek called. Jason sat across from him in a high-end bar that had once been their regular haunt. Derek's face, once smug and full of arrogance, now carried the faintest shadow of desperation. His designer suit was still impeccable, but there was something in the way Derek's fingers tapped nervously on the glass in front of him, a telltale sign of fear. "You look well," Derek said, his tone too forced to sound casual. Jason smiled. "It's been a while. You hear the rumors going around?" Derek leaned in, lowering his voice. "People are saying crazy things about the company. Investigations, financial collapse. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Jason met Derek's gaze, the satisfaction of this moment burning through him. "Why would I know? I'm just an outsider now, remember?" Derek's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games, Jason. You're a part of this. I can feel it. I'm just living my life, Derek. Trying to pick up the pieces you left me with." Jason leaned back, folding his arms. He kept his tone light, casual, as though Derek's downfall was of no consequence to him. But inside, Jason reveled in it. Derek clenched his jaw. "You've always been a bitter man, Jason, holding grudges like a child. You think you can hurt me? I'm untouchable." Jason chuckled softly. "We'll see." A week later, the investigation into Derek's company went public. The authorities raided his offices, seizing files, servers, and everything else they could get their hands on. The media had a field day, running headlines about corporate corruption, financial fraud, and insider trading. Derek's face was plastered across every major news outlet, his reputation now irreversibly tainted. Jason watched it all unfold from his modest apartment, sipping coffee as reporters dug deeper into the scandal. The world was starting to see Derek for who he truly was, a fraud, a man who had built his empire on lies. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Jason had one final card to play, and it involved Clara. He hadn't spoken to her since the day she left, and he had no intention of rekindling anything. She had chosen her side when she walked out of their marriage to be with Derek. But now, Derek's empire was crumbling, and Jason knew Clara well enough to predict her next move. She had always cared about one thing above all else: security. As soon as Derek's well started to dry up, she would run. So, Jason decided to give her a push. Using a fake name, he arranged a meeting with Clara at a local cafe. She looked as polished as ever when she arrived, but there was an edge of unease in her expression. Her expensive clothes couldn't hide the uncertainty in her eyes. "Clara," Jason said, barely glancing up as she sat across from him. "Good to see you again." Clara shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Why am I here, Jason?" "Because you're smart," Jason replied smoothly. "And I know you've been keeping tabs on the news." Her lips tightened. "Derek's dealing with it." Jason's smile widened. "Is he? Or are you already planning your next escape?" Clara's eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and frustration. "What do you want, Jason?" "I want you to know that when Derek goes down, and he will go down, you'll be left with nothing. No money, no assets, just a disgraced husband and a tarnished name." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "But if you help me, I can make sure you don't end up empty-handed." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Help you? How?" "I know you have access to certain documents, things Derek wouldn't want anyone to see. You bring those to me, and I'll make sure you're not dragged down with him." Clara hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if someone might overhear. She had always been calculating, and Jason could see the wheels turning in her mind. After a long pause, she finally nodded. "Fine, but if you screw me over, I'll make sure you regret it." Jason chuckled. "You don't have to worry about me, Clara. I'm only interested in taking what's mine." Clara delivered, just as Jason expected. The documents she handed over were the final nail in Derek's coffin. They revealed not only his financial crimes, but also his dealings with criminal organizations, something that even his most powerful allies couldn't protect him from. With the documents in hand, Jason turned them over to Ryan and the authorities. Within days, Derek was arrested, his assets frozen, and his entire empire crumbled in front of the world. And Clara? She was left with nothing. Derek had hidden his wealth too well, and by the time Jason's revenge was complete, there was nothing left for her to claim. She had no choice but to start over, just like Jason had. Only this time, There would be no second chances for her. Jason stood outside his old company building, watching as the name Derek Hamilton was stripped from the door. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Ryan, confirming Derek's conviction. It was over. Jason had taken everything from the man who had betrayed him. The fire inside him had burned brightly. But now, standing in the wreckage of the life he'd once known, Jason realized it hadn't brought him the satisfaction he thought it would. The victory was hollow, but it was his. Jason stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, watching the swirl of media chaos erupting in front of him. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes illuminated the evening like lightning strikes. And in the center of it all, Derek Hamilton, now in handcuffs, was led out by officers, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. It was everything Jason had wanted. Derek humiliated, stripped of his power, and facing a long prison sentence. But as he watched Derek being loaded into the police van, a strange emptiness settled in Jason's chest. The moment that should have brought him satisfaction left him feeling hollow. The bitter taste of revenge lingered, sharp and cold. His life hadn't magically snapped back into place. Clara was gone. His business was gone. And though Derek was finally paying for his betrayal, Jason didn't feel like the victor he had imagined. As the van doors slammed shut and the crowd began to disperse, Jason turned and walked away from the courthouse, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. There was no one waiting for him at home. No family, no friends. Only the silence of his empty apartment, a far cry from the bustling life he had once known. That night, Jason lay on his worn-out couch, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. He had no idea what came next. For months, he had lived for this moment, for the downfall of Derek Hamilton, the man who had betrayed him and stolen everything. He had plotted, schemed, and sacrificed everything for this victory. But now that it was over, all he could see was the wreckage of his own life. In the distance, the faint hum of city traffic drifted through the open window. Jason closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise, but his mind wouldn't let go of the past. Derek's face, twisted in fury, haunted him, as did Clara's final look when she realized she'd lost everything. He rolled over, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Was this it? Was this what he had been fighting for? The following weeks passed in a strange blur. With Derek's empire in ruins, Jason received occasional updates from Ryan. Derek's sentence was handed down swiftly. 15 years for corporate fraud, money laundering, and a laundry list of other charges. There was no trial. Derek's legal team didn't even try to fight it. His fall had been too public, too damning. Clara, meanwhile, had disappeared from the public eye. Rumors floated around that she had moved to another city, but Jason didn't care enough to confirm them. She was no longer a part of his life, and he was more than happy to leave her in the past. One evening, Ryan called, breaking the silence that had enveloped Jason's life. "You did it, Jason," Ryan said, his voice a mix of admiration and caution. "Derek's gone for good. But listen, you might want to lay low for a while. Derek had some connections, people who might not take kindly to what happened." Jason frowned, sitting up on the couch. "Connections? What do you mean?" Ryan hesitated before speaking again. "Derek was involved with some dangerous people. You uncovered a lot more than just corporate fraud. They're not happy about the attention." Jason felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You're saying someone might come after me?" "I'm saying be careful. Keep your head down, at least for a while." Jason hung up the phone, unease settling over him. He had known Derek wasn't a saint, but he hadn't realized the full extent of the people he'd been involved with. The thought of becoming a target unsettled him, but he shrugged it off. He hadn't worked this hard to live in fear. Weeks passed, and Jason tried to rebuild his life in small, tentative steps. He took on freelance work, consulting for small businesses that reminded him of the early days of his own company. The work was decent, but it didn't carry the same passion or drive. Every day, he fought off the nagging question, what was his purpose now? One afternoon, while walking through the park, Jason ran into an old acquaintance, Sarah, who had worked for him during his company's heyday. She was sitting on a bench, her two children playing nearby. "Jason, is that you?" Sarah asked, surprise lighting up her face. Jason smiled weakly. "Hey, Sarah. It's been a while." "It has. I heard what happened with Derek. I'm sorry for everything you went through." Her voice softened, genuine sympathy in her eyes. "But it's good to see you out here. How have you been?" Jason shrugged, unsure how to answer that question. "I'm getting by." Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "You know, a lot of people were rooting for you. After everything Derek did, we wanted to see you bounce back. Have you thought about starting something new?" Jason's heart clenched at the thought. Starting something new? He didn't even know where to begin. "I'm not sure I have it in me anymore," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "You always had the drive, Jason, and you were a good boss. People respected you, not just because of the business, but because you cared. Maybe it's time to start caring again." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so much time wrapped up in revenge, so consumed by his need to take Derek down, that he had forgotten why he'd started his company in the first place. It wasn't about the money or the power. It was about building something that mattered, something that gave people hope. Jason nodded, more to himself than to Sarah. "Maybe you're right." That night, as Jason sat in his apartment, staring at the empty walls, a new thought began to take root in his mind. He had destroyed Derek's empire, but that didn't mean his own life had to remain in ruins. He could start over, not in the same way as before, not with the ambition to build a corporate giant, but with something smaller, something that reflected the values he had once believed in. He thought about the people like Sarah, people who had worked for him, believed in him, and trusted him before everything fell apart. The path to revenge had been dark, but perhaps there was a way to step back into the light. Jason opened his laptop and started drafting ideas. He wasn't sure where this new direction would lead, but for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But just as the flame of hope began to ignite within Jason, a knock at the door disrupted the quiet. He glanced at the clock. It was late. Too late for any casual visitor. A chill ran down his spine as Ryan's warning echoed in his ears. Rising from the couch, Jason approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw a man standing in the dimly lit hallway. He was tall, wearing a black coat, his face shadowed by the angle of the light. Jason hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. Something felt off, but he couldn't place it. Another knock, louder this time. "Mr. Myers?" The man's voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it. "We need to talk." Jason's heart raced as he stepped back from the door. He had no idea who this man was, but something told him that whatever conversation he was about to have, it wasn't going to be pleasant. The hollow victory he had felt just days before now seemed fragile, and the shadow of Derek's past reached out toward him, darker than he had anticipated. Jason's hand froze on the doorknob. His breath caught in his throat as he stood there, listening to the man's measured voice on the other side. "Mr. Myers, I don't want to make this difficult. Just open the door, and we can have a chat. It's in your best interest." Jason's pulse quickened. His mind raced back to Ryan's warning. Derek had some dangerous connections. Whoever was on the other side of the door wasn't here for a friendly conversation. Every instinct screamed at Jason to leave, to escape. He backed away slowly, his footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor, his eyes darting to the back window. Another knock, sharper this time, reverberated through the small apartment. "You don't want me to come in, Jason. Open the door." Jason's heart hammered in his chest. He turned and moved toward the window, his mind calculating his next move. He could make it down the fire escape, disappear into the night. But then what? How far could he run before they found him again? His hand was on the window latch when he heard it, the sound of metal scraping against the lock. They were breaking in. There was no time. Jason yanked the window open and climbed out, his foot slipping slightly as he scrambled onto the fire escape. Just as he pulled himself onto the platform, He heard the door burst open behind him. "Mr. Myers," the man shouted, his voice echoing into the alley below. Jason didn't wait to hear more. He bolted down the iron stairs, taking 2 steps at a time, his muscles straining with each hurried movement. The fire escape rattled beneath him, but he pushed on, adrenaline fueling his every step. He reached the bottom and darted into the dark alley. His mind raced. He had to lose them, find a place to hide. The streets were mostly deserted at this hour, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows that seemed to chase him. He didn't stop running until he was blocks away, his lungs burning with each breath. Only then did he pause, ducking into a side street and crouching behind a dumpster. He pressed his back against the cold, brick wall, trying to steady his breathing, his mind spinning with questions. Who were they? What did they want? And most importantly, how had they found him? The hours stretched into an eerie silence as Jason huddled in the shadows, waiting, listening. The sounds of the city faded into the background, and all that remained was the relentless pounding of his own heartbeat. He was alone, on the run, and now fully aware that Derek's world still had a grip on him, even after his victory. Finally, when the streets felt safe enough to walk, Jason slipped out of his hiding spot and made his way to the one place he thought he could find answers: Ryan's apartment. Ryan's building was in a quiet neighborhood across town. Jason walked there cautiously, sticking to the alleys and side streets, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Every face he passed seemed suspect. Every car's headlights felt like a spotlight tracking him. When he reached Ryan's building, he buzzed the door. No answer. Jason cursed under his breath and buzzed again. After what felt like an eternity, Ryan's groggy voice crackled through the intercom. "Who is it?" "It's Jason," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "We need to talk. Now." There was a long pause, and then the door clicked open. Jason rushed inside, making his way up the narrow staircase to Ryan's apartment. When Ryan opened the door, his expression shifted from confusion to concern the moment he saw Jason's face. "What happened?" Ryan asked, stepping aside to let him in. Jason walked into the small apartment, his body tense with fear and adrenaline. "They came for me. Someone from Derek's circle. They broke into my place. I barely got out." Ryan's face paled. "I told you to keep your head down." "I was keeping my head down," Jason snapped, pacing the room. "But they found me anyway." "Who are these people, Ryan? Why are they after me?" Ryan rubbed his eyes, clearly struggling to process the situation. Derek was involved in more than just corporate fraud. He had ties to a criminal syndicate, money laundering, smuggling, that sort of thing. When you exposed him, you didn't just ruin his life. You disrupted their operations, cost them millions. They're not the kind of people who let something like that slide. Jason felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "So what? They're going to kill me?" Ryan hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. "I don't know. But they're dangerous, Jason. You need to disappear for a while. Lay low somewhere they can't find you." Jason ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning with possibilities. Disappear? He'd already lost everything. His business, his wife, his reputation. Now he had to give up the one scrap of life he had left. "No," Jason said firmly. "I'm not running. I won't let them take everything from me again." Ryan stared at him, shocked. "What are you going to do?" "You can't fight them." Jason's jaw tightened. "I don't need to fight them. I just need to turn the tables." Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" Jason began pacing again, the gears in his mind turning faster. "There's always a way out. I need leverage, something I can use against them, something that will make them back off." "Leverage?" Ryan echoed, incredulous. "You're talking about negotiating with criminals." "If it's the only way to survive, then yes," Jason shot back. "I didn't come this far just to die at the hands of Derek's shady connections. There has to be a way to make them leave me alone." Ryan stared at him, worry etched into every line of his face. "Jason, you're in over your head." "Maybe," Jason admitted, "but I don't have another choice." The next morning, Jason set his plan in motion. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he had nothing left to lose. If he wanted to end this once and for all, he would have to dive back into the murky world of Derek's connections. His first step was to track down someone who could lead him to the people pulling the strings, the syndicate behind Derek's empire. Jason had seen glimpses of these people in the financial records he'd uncovered, names that didn't match any official business listings but appeared frequently in private communications between Derek and his shady contacts. He had a few leads, and one of them was a man named Carl Hess, a notorious fixer who handled problems for people like Derek. Jason spent the better part of the day tracking Carl down. He asked old contacts, called in favors, and eventually his persistence paid off. He found Carl in a seedy bar on the outskirts of the city, nursing a drink and watching a poker game unfold in the back room. Jason approached him cautiously, his nerves taut as wire. "Carl Hess." Carl glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he took in Jason's appearance. "Who's asking?" "Jason Myers. I need to talk to you about Derek Hamilton." Carl's expression remained unreadable, but Jason noticed a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Derek? Oh, thought you and him were finished." "We are," Jason said, his voice steady. "But I know what Derek was involved in. I know about his ties to your people, and I need your help." Carl raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a half-smile. "My help? You've got guts, Myers. What makes you think I'd lift a finger to help you?" Jason leaned in, lowering his voice. "Because I have something your bosses want. Something Derek kept hidden from them." Carl's smile faded. "And what would that be?" Jason met Carl's gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Insurance. The kind that makes people like you think twice before pulling the trigger." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of the threat hanging in the air between them. Finally, Carl leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "All right, Myers," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Let's talk." Jason sat across from Carl Hess, the notorious fixer, in the dimly lit backroom of the seedy bar. The air was thick with tension, but Jason kept his face unreadable. He had staked everything on this moment, on convincing Carl that he wasn't just some washed-up businessman, but someone worth listening to. This was his final move, the last desperate hand he would play to survive. Carl's sharp eyes scanned Jason, sizing him up. "All right, Myers, you've got my attention. What kind of insurance are we talking about?" Jason leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I uncovered more than just Derek's financial crimes. I've got evidence of the syndicate's dealings, money laundering, trafficking, off-the-books transactions. Everything. And I'm not the only one who has it." Carl's smile faltered. "Go on." "I've spread the files to multiple locations," Jason continued, keeping his tone calm, though his pulse raced beneath the surface. "If anything happens to me, it all goes public. Names, accounts, the entire network, everything comes crashing down. I don't think your bosses would be happy about that, Carl." Carl stared at Jason for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Jason could see the wheels turning behind the man's cold eyes, calculating the risk, deciding if he believed him. Then Carl leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "You got some guts, Myers. I'll give you that." Carl picked up his drink and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Jason. "But here's the thing. You're not the first guy to think you can outsmart people like us. You say you got leverage, fine. But leverage only works if you can control it. So why don't you tell me? How do I know you won't just hand this over to the authorities? What stops you from bringing everything down, with or without us coming after you?" Jason knew this was the moment that would make or break his entire plan. He had expected this question and prepared his answer. "Because I don't want to go to war with your syndicate," Jason said, his voice steady and sincere. "I just want out. I've lost everything. My business, my wife, my life. I'm done fighting. This leverage? It's my safety net. I'm not interested in ruining anyone, but I won't let anyone ruin me either. All I want is to be left alone. Let me walk away, and you'll never hear from me again." Carl studied him, weighing the words. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the hum of the poker game in the background. Finally, Carl set his glass down and leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You're either very smart or very stupid, Myers. But here's what I'm going to do. I'll pass this up the chain. I can't make decisions on my own in this case. But if you're lying, if this is all some bluff," Carl let the threat hang in the air, his smile fading, "you won't get a second chance." Jason didn't flinch. "I'm not lying. You'll find that out soon enough." Carl nodded slowly, as if satisfied. "All right then, consider yourself lucky that you're getting this chance. I'll be in touch." Jason left the bar, his heart pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had done it. He had planted the seed of doubt in Carl's mind, and now it was up to the syndicate to decide whether they would let him go or come after him harder than before. But Jason knew he had given them enough to think twice about making a move. He had bought himself time, maybe even freedom. For the first time in months, as he walked through the city streets, Jason allowed himself to breathe. It wasn't over yet, but it was close. The weight of revenge, betrayal, and survival had taken its toll, but he had survived the darkest parts. Now, it was about finding a way to rebuild, not just his life, but his sense of peace. Days passed, and Jason kept his head low, waiting for Carl's promised call. He had left his apartment, moving into a motel under a fake name, changing his routine, constantly watching his back. He didn't know if he was safe or if he was being watched, but the silence stretched on, leaving him in a limbo of uncertainty. Then, one evening, his burner phone rang. Jason answered it, his heart thudding in his chest. "It's Carl," the voice on the other end said. "I spoke to my people. They've decided to let you walk." Relief washed over Jason like a flood. "That's it? I'm free?" "Not quite," Carl replied, his tone cool and dangerous. "You're free as long as you stay in line. If you so much as breathe near that evidence, or try anything funny, they'll come for you. Understand?" Jason nodded, even though Carl couldn't see him. "I understand. I'm done. I just want to live my life." "Good. Then you get what you want. But remember this, Myers. We don't forget. You'll never be entirely free." The line went dead, and Jason stared at the phone in his hand. The final piece had fallen into place. The syndicate had decided to let him live, but they would always be watching. He wasn't free, not really, but he was alive. And for now, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Jason tried to pick up the pieces of his life. He started working quietly, taking small consulting jobs, staying out of the limelight, keeping his head down. He no longer had the ambition to rebuild his empire. It wasn't about the money or power anymore. He just wanted to live a life of peace, far away from the chaos he had endured. He thought about Clara sometimes, wondered what had happened to her after Derek's fall. But those thoughts didn't hold the same sting they once did. She was part of a chapter he had closed, and while the wounds were still there, they didn't bleed like they used to. Instead, Jason focused on himself. He met new people, made new connections, ones that weren't tied to his past. He found a small apartment in a quiet part of the city, far from the world of corporate cutthroats and criminal syndicates. It wasn't the life he had once envisioned, but it was something he could call his own. And slowly, day by day, Jason began to feel something unfamiliar creeping back into his life. Hope. One evening, months after the dust had settled, Jason stood on the balcony of his new apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city buzzed with life around him, but for once, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt distant, like the backdrop to a new story he was beginning to write for himself. The phone on his kitchen counter buzzed with a new message. Jason glanced at it, seeing a notification from Ryan. "I heard you're doing okay. I'm glad. Stay safe." Jason smiled faintly, placing the phone back down. He took a deep breath, inhaling the cool evening air. His past was behind him now. Derek was gone. The syndicate had let him walk, and Clara was nothing but a memory. It wasn't the life he had once dreamed of, but it was his. And after everything, that was enough. Jason turned back toward the warmth of his apartment, the door closing softly behind him as the night settled over the city. The end.